In this video, I'll be testing 7 of the most popular ultra-high performance all-season tyres on the market. If you've seen any of my previous ultra-high performance all-season tyre tests, you'll be happy to know that 6 of these tyres I've never tested before, and the 7th allows us to sort of cross-reference between all the all-season tyres I've tested as it's appeared in every test I've done so far. You'll also be happy to know that 2 of these tyres are brand new. I have the Falken Azenis FK460 AS, which is their brand new ultra-high performance all-season tyre, and the Pirelli P0 AS Plus 3, which is Pirelli's latest offering. Both of these have been launched in the last 6 months, and I don't think I've seen them tested anywhere, so it'll be really exciting to see how they stack up against the more established competition. In this test, I'll be looking at the dry performance, the wet performance, the comfort and the noise levels of the tyres, and in a later video we're going to dig into the snow performance of the tyres to give us a really complete overview of which of these tyres is best. Should be a really interesting test, especially because this time I'm using this, which has 717 horsepower and is rear-wheel drive and is manual. So if you're interested in watching me crash, well, let's get on with the testing. These are ultra-high performance all-season tyres. So I think, I'm going to argue this, but you can change your own score rating on the website. I'm going to rate the wet performance as the most important quality of the tyre. Why? Well, these should really be 3-season tyres. We're going to test the snow performance, but generally, compared to a full winter tyre, they do lack in snow. None of them are severe snow rated, 3-peak rated. So these generally get used more year round in climates that get a lot of wet. So that's why I think the wet performance is so important, and it's so much fun. Now, the track I'm testing on this week is quite a short track. It's around a 50-second lap in the wet. So the times you'll see on screen are probably a little bit closer than you're used to seeing, but trust me, there are differences. Even if it's only 2 or 3 seconds, that's quite a lot subjectively. Now, the slowest tyre of the test was the Atlas. Now, this is made by Linglong, I believe, which is a Chinese company. And it is the cheapest tyre on test by a chunk of margin, and it is the slowest round wet handling. But you know what? It's not a total disaster. It was, even on this 717 brake horsepower Hellcat, it wasn't like trying to kill me or spit me off. It just had a little bit less grip everywhere. It was slower to turn in. You'd pick up some like understeer mid-corner and it would take a long time to recover. You'd kick the back out by mistake, because that happens very easily with the smallest of throttle movements, and it would just take a little bit of time to recover. It was the only tyre that was in a 50-second lap window, so it was separated by time and by subjective handling. It was my least favourite, but it's not terrible. For its price, it's done okay. The next group of tyres, all in the 49s, was the BFG General and Vredestein. Now, their times were fairly similar, but they did feel quite different. The BFGoodrich was, it was a good tyre. It felt sporty, it turned in nicely. It did pick up some understeer, not as much as the Atlas. And understeer is safe, so we're not speaking bad of that, but on a performance lap time, it does hurt the lap time. But it was one of the tyres that were more affected, or was more affected by the deeper puddles of water. So there was a bit of hydroplaning. Sadly, I don't have time to do a proper hydroplaning test this week. I would have loved to, but certainly BFG was one of those that seemed to be upset a little bit more. General was broadly similar. Perhaps it didn't quite have as much hydroplaning problems as the BFG, but very similar tyre. The Vredestein, on the other hand, well, that was let's say not sporty. No problems with standing water. This was the only tyre I've managed to do my laps on without having any issues with the puddles, but it did feel soft. It didn't feel like a sports tyre. These are ultra high performance all season tyres, so I'm not benchmarking these against, I don't expect it to behave like a summer tyre, but of the group of all season tyres, it did feel pretty sluggish. So that meant as you turned, it was slow to turn in. The front end felt a bit fluffy, the rear kind of sat down, everything just happened a bit more slowly, but it was predictable. So if you're wanting a sports tyre, perhaps it's not ideal, but if you're wanting a predictable, safe tyre, I was the most consistent on this tyre. Next up, nearly a second ahead, which is a lot of time around a short course, I keep saying, was the Falken. Now this tyre felt lovely. It steered well, it loaded up nicely, it was predictable. At the limit, it had a bit of understeer, which is the smart way to be. The only negative I'd say about the Falken was at the limit, you couldn't quite get exactly what was going on the front axle, but for an all-season tyre, it's absolutely fine and acceptable, and I think it's a very good tyre. Had buckets of traction, even in the wet. You could use the throttle noticeably more than the previous tyres. Next up was the Pirelli. Now this is the new Pirelli, and traditionally, or previously I should say, their all-season products haven't been the best in the wet, but this one's made a huge step forward. It felt very much like the Falken in that it was a great turning tyre, had buckets of grip, but it left you wanting a little bit at the very limit on the front axle to really understand what was going on and to make it a really consistent, fun experience. But it was a very good tyre. The Falken and the Pirelli are both absolutely fantastic in the wet. Good job to both of those new tyres. However, the fastest tyre, and my favourite subjectively, was the Continental ExtremeContact Sport, no not Sport, the Continental ExtremeContact DWS 06 Plus, and I wish they'd shorten these names because it's a lot to remember when you're driving. Now the Continental, I know a lot of you will be disappointed that the cross-reference tyre between this test and the previous test is the Continental and not the Michelin. Two reasons for this. One, I couldn't get the Michelin in time, and two, the Continental was, in the previous test, the better handling tyre in wet and dry handling. So I really wanted the best benchmark to be that benchmark. So we have it, we have the Continental, and once again it is setting the standard. It's not leaps and bounds ahead of the Pirelli or the Falken, it's actually fairly close, but what the Continental gives you, it just gives you a little bit more crispness in the steering, it just feels a bit brighter, there's a bit more predictability around the limit, and just a little bit more grip in various places. So, very good. The Continental was, let me throw this in right at the end, the Continental were a little bit upset by some of the deeper puddles, but no more than any of the others really. It was only really the Vredestein that stood out as the non-hydroplaning tyre. But it was a very good group of tyres. Thankfully, and it doesn't always happen, thankfully, wet braking and wet handling correlated really, really nicely. In terms of percentages, the Falken moved a little bit closer to the front, but the general order in the top tyres remained the same. Will this repeat in dry handling and dry braking? Let's go find out. Good news, yes it does. Well, sort of. The Atlas might have ruined my little plan of everything being perfect, but as always, things were closer in the dry, and this car's a monster. It didn't feel that quick in the wet, but I was never more than maybe half throttle with so much power. But now we have supercharger whine and power, and now it feels fast on this tiny little track. Anyway, enough about the car, we're talking about tyres. So the Vredestein was the slowest tyre. What I felt in the wet about it feeling a bit softer to turn and maybe a bit more tread pattern movement was naturally magnified in the dry because we're going so much faster, which meant the tyre was the slowest around the lap, and it just had lots of noisy understeer. This car is actually set up quite heavily for understeer, which is probably smart on Dodge's part, but the Vredestein was the most understeer. It was also the worst in dry braking, so maybe that means the tyre will be best in the snow. We will find out in the future, subscribe for that. But around the dry handling, the Vredestein felt the most touring. Next up was the General. Now the General did feel a little bit tighter than the Vredestein. It posted exactly the same lap time, but again, it was just a little bit imprecise around the limit. Next up was the BFGoodrich and the Atlas punching well above its weight. Now, the BFG had a bit more understeer of the, things fast. The BFG had a little bit more understeer of the two tyres. And we know understeer is safe, and this Challenger is, as we just said, set up for understeer, but I think that cost it a little bit of lap time. The Atlas felt very good. It was one of my joint favourite in terms of sportiness and handling, and I really did enjoy going around the lap. Like I said, it's punched well above its weight, but when you actually look at the tread pattern, it does look a lot like a summer pattern. The final trio of tyres was the Falken, Continental and Pirelli in that order. The Pirelli was the fastest. Like in the wet, I felt like the Continental just needed a little bit more detail through the front axle, but it turned quickly, it felt like a good tyre, it had buckets of grip and I enjoyed driving it. The Continental was very, very good subjectively. Really sporty for an ultra high performance all season tyre. I've seen this in other tests. It's always done best in dry handling, and other times I've tested this DWS 06 Plus, and I'm glad it's still very good in this big size. It did seem to get a little bit hot by the end of lap 2. We're pushing the left front particularly hard, but I'm telling you this about the Continental just so I have something negative to say. I think all the tyres were pretty hot by the end of lap 2. Some were pretty hot by the end of lap 1. but generally these tires aren't going to see a lot of track work. And finally, the Pirelli, the new P0 AS Plus 3. I think that's the right order of letters and acronyms. Now, when I drove this tire in the wet, I was a little bit worried inside that it would have given up some of its dry performance, because Pirelli generally, they're enjoyable products to drive, but traditionally the wet performance of their all-season, their UHP all-season tire hasn't been up to scratch, but it's kind of paid back in the dry. So after I drove it in the wet and worked out who was who, I was just a tiny bit concerned that maybe they've given up some of that dry performance. But as you know, I test blind, and when I was going through the results, set 2, dry set 2, I marked as probably my favorite subjectively, and it was the fastest. And when I found out it was the Pirelli, I was pleasantly surprised. So good job Pirelli on this new product. It perhaps wasn't the very sharpest to turn, but it was close enough to the Falken and Continental. But it just had good grip, it was good on the brakes, and it was a good all-round package. Speaking of braking, the Continental got back to first position by the smallest of margins, ahead of the Falken and the Pirelli, but all those 3 tyres were again a step ahead of the rest. This has been a thoroughly enjoyable dry handling test, even on this short circuit. This Hellcat, it's a big old girl, but it's nothing like a modern German car, it's nothing like a modern BMW M3, and for that I love it, because you can do some really crazy stuff, incredibly easy with it, and I mean, muscle, power. But I think the disadvantage of the car is about to rear its head, because we're going to noise and comfort next, and as you can hear, this is a particularly noisy car, and I don't think I'm going to learn a whole lot, but let's try anyway. Noise and comfort, and what the vehicle giveth in fun gets taken away in NVH analysis. It's been particularly difficult, and I always find it difficult. It's not my strongest subject. In terms of comfort, would you believe the Vredestein, which I've been moaning about being a little bit too soft for handling, did have an advantage, in my opinion, over the bigger impacts. However, that only really applied if it was one. If you're hitting multiple things in a row, like the softness of the tyre would mean the tyre would still be wobbling through a little bit more than some of the other tyres, which could also be quite annoying. But I think if I was picking one purely for like big impact comfort, it would be the Vredestein. And that's probably all I can really tell you about noise and comfort. We did do noise, but the car makes so many different whines and groans and moans. It's a wonderful sounding car, but when you're trying to analyze tire noise, it makes it very difficult. But I would say if I had to say something, Continental might have just been, it just felt like a slightly firmer overall package, and there was maybe a hint of tread pattern noise when turning, but there's absolutely no way I can say you should buy this tire if you want the best NVH, the best noise and comfort. The Vredestein is the only one that to me stood out as being ever so slightly more comfortable, but the noise levels were broadly similar. So we can pretty much write off that exercise as the Hellcat's fun, let's not worry about noise and comfort. So for the overall results, I've been kind of debating with myself whether to include a value score based on purchase price versus treadwear warranty, because treadwear warranty isn't a wear test, but in theory the tire should get there. So for the results I'm presenting to you, or for the order or the grouping you're going to see on screen, I have actually included a low weighted value score, but as always there's a link in the description. I'm kind of shying away from telling you what the best tire is, what the winner tire is, because best is so subjective. So there's a link in the description to the Tire Reviews website where you can adjust your own score weighting and work out which tire fits your own requirements. But for these results, value is in. Basically, we've ended up with 2 groups of tires. We've got the Vredestein, Atlas, BFGoodrich in general, and then we've got these 3, the Pirelli, the Continental and the Falken. So 2 of the new tires and one of the established best in the sector, and then this. The reason in this test these 3 have fallen so far behind in terms of percentage overall scoring is mostly the wet performance, especially wet braking, but all 4 of them struggled quite a lot in wet braking compared to these 3. And for my weighting, that carries a lot of value. The Atlas does win some points back in value because it's very cheap, and it doesn't have a 50,000 mile warranty, but I think it's 40 or 45,000. So your cost per mile is actually very low on the Atlas, much lower than anything else. But again, it's the wet braking is the issue. It was fine in the dry, and it does, I think I've said in the video already, it does kind of look like a summer pattern. So when we get around to snow testing, I expect this is where the Atlas will like fall off the charts essentially. As for these 3, You've got the brand new Pirelli, the brand new Falken, and the Continental ExtremeContact DWS 06 Plus. Now on my score weighting, the Continental and the new Pirelli tied perfectly on overall percentage, but the Falken was very, like 0.2% behind. So I'm happy to recommend any of these tires. Across all the tests, these three were always one of the best, and none of them had any massive drawbacks. The Falken only really lost out on essentially tying for a top 3 win because its wet braking was slightly longer than these two, but in everything else, the Falken was outstanding. If I was to pick one, I think I'd probably still aim towards the Continental, purely because it's got that steering dynamic that's just slightly crisper, which is something I really value in a tyre. But then if I was recommending, the Continental is the most expensive, and they all have 50,000 mile tread life warranties. So if I was recommending a tyre, I'd be hard pressed for most people to recommend the more expensive Continental over, say, the Falken, which is over a set in this size, it's over $120 cheaper. So that's quite a significant saving, and in theory, you're getting 99.9% of the performance, and you've still got your 50,000 mile treadwear warranty. I think the distinction is going to really come when we look at snow testing. So when I get around to do the snow testing later this year, the video will come out and I'll update all these results as a complete picture. I know, or we already know, the Continental is excellent in the snow. Pirelli are promising a lot of positive steps forward for their products. So the previous P0 all-season tyre really wasn't that good in snow, but they're promising this is a big step forward. And I've chatted with Falken about the snow performance of this, and they're very quietly confident that this is, I mean, they're really excited to get this tested in the snow against its peers. So I think these three should be really interesting. I have no idea what these three are doing, but I know the BFG and the General, they are older products now. People are still buying them, they're still for sale, but they are getting on the older side. So I'm not entirely sure how I expect those to perform. The Vredestein, with its soft handling, I expect could have quite a good snow performance too. So you know the score. If you're interested in seeing that, make sure you subscribe. Any questions, please ask below. And as always, safe motoring.